Normandy, summer 1944. The air is thick with dust and the cloying scent of cider apples rotting in the heat. It has been weeks since D-Day, and the initial rush of the invasion has bogged down into a brutal game of attrition among the hedgerows, the bocage. A squad of German soldiers from the 12th SS Panzer Division moves cautiously along the edge of an ancient stone wall. They are hardened veterans, men who have survived the freezing hell of the Eastern Front and the thunderous artillery barrages of the British Army. They know the sounds of war. They know the shriek of a diving Typhoon fighter and the distinct rattle of a Sherman tank's tracks. Noise is the harbinger of death. But here, in this sunken lane, there is only silence. The birds have long since fled. The wind rustles the leaves of the poplars, masking the sound of boots on gravel. The point man, a corporal with weary eyes, pauses to adjust his helmet. He scans the dense tree line 300 yards away. Nothing moves. There is no glint of metal, no unnatural shape, no muzzle flash. He turns back to signal his squad to advance. In that split second, without a sound that the human ear could register in time, the corporal's head snaps back violently. He collapses into the dirt, a puppet with its strings cut. There was no crack of a rifle, no smoke drifting from the bushes, just a sudden, inexplicable death. Panic is immediate and contagious. The remaining soldiers scramble for the cover of the ditch, pressing their bodies into the earth. They do not return fire because there is nothing to fire at. They are fighting a ghost. The silence of the French countryside returns, but now it is heavy, suffocating, and pregnant with threat. One of the young privates, his hands shaking as he grips his Kar 98K, whispers the words that had begun to circulate through the Wehrmacht ranks like a virus since the landings in Sicily. Kanadische Scharfschütze, Canadian sniper. In a war defined by the industrial scale of destruction, by the terrifying roar of artillery, the grinding treads of Tiger tanks, and the firestorms of aerial bombing, it seems paradoxical. Why would an army equipped with the most advanced war machines in history be paralyzed by a single man with a bolt-action rifle? But that was the reality of the Western Front. The thing the German soldier came to fear most was not the overwhelming firepower of the Allies, but the invisible, singular determination of the Canadian sniper. A shadow who controlled the battlefield not with a barrage, but with one bullet. A ghost who turned the very landscape against them. Why? What was it about these men from across the Atlantic that made them so uniquely terrifying? Why did the mere rumor of a Canadian presence in the sector cause German officers to remove their insignias and hide in the mud? To understand the fear, we must first understand the hunters. The answer lies thousands of miles away from the blood-soaked fields of Europe. It lies in the vast, unforgiving geography of Canada itself. Unlike the conscripts drawn from the industrial cities of England or the urban centers of the United States, a disproportionate number of Canadian volunteers in World War II did not learn to shoot on a military firing range. They learned in the boreal forests of northern Ontario, on the wind-swept prairies of Saskatchewan, and in the rugged mountains of British Columbia. In the 1930s and 40s, Canada was still a nation defined by its frontier. For many young men, particularly those from rural communities and Indigenous First Nations, the rifle was not a weapon of war. It was a tool of survival. This was the Canadian advantage. It was a distinct cultural heritage that the German military academy, with all its Prussian discipline and rigid doctrine, could not replicate. Consider the environment these men grew up in. To put food on the table during the Great Depression, a boy in rural Manitoba had to track a deer for miles through deep snow. He learned to read the wind not by a manual, but by the feel of it on his cheek. He learned that a single snapped twig could cost him his dinner. He learned patience, the kind of profound, absolute stillness that allows a human being to blend into the natural world until they are nothing more than a part of the landscape. This was the concept of fieldcraft. When war broke out, the British Army had to teach its recruits how to be invisible. The Americans had to teach their soldiers how to lead a moving target. The Canadians simply handed their young men a uniform and a Lee Enfield. The skills were already in their blood. German intelligence reports from the era reflect a growing bewilderment and respect for this capability. One captured German officer noted a distinct difference in the way Allied troops fought. He remarked, "The Americans overwhelm you with fire. The British confuse you with maneuvering. But the Canadians shoot like hunters. They wait, they watch, and they never miss." This hunter mentality translated perfectly to the chaotic nature of modern warfare. A hunter does not panic when cut off from his unit. He adapts. A hunter does not need an officer to tell him where the best vantage point is. He instinctively finds the high ground, the shadow, the blind spot in the prey's vision. Furthermore, the Canadian climate had hardened them against the elements. The bitter cold of the Italian winter in 1943 and the damp, freezing mud of the Netherlands in 1944 broke the morale of many soldiers. But for a trapper from the Yukon or a farmer from Alberta, freezing temperatures were a fact of life. While others shivered and lost their focus, the Canadian sniper lay still, wrapped in burlap and patience, his heart rate slow, his finger warm enough on the trigger to deliver the kill shot. They were not just soldiers trained to fight. They were predators let loose in a target-rich environment. And as the war progressed, this innate skill would be honed by specialized equipment and ruthless tactics that would turn the Canadian sniper into the most effective psychological weapon on the Western Front. To translate the hunter's instinct into effective warfare, the Canadian soldier needed a weapon capable of matching his patience with precision. He found it in a rifle that would become legendary, not for its complexity, but for its rugged reliability and terrifying rate of fire. The Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I T. By 1943, while the German Wehrmacht relied heavily on the Karabiner 98K, a finely machined Mauser design, the Canadians were fielding what is widely considered the best sniper rifle of the Second World War. To the untrained eye, it looked like the standard infantry rifle issued to millions of Commonwealth troops. But the T stamp meant telescopic. These were not random rifles pulled from a crate. At the Small Arms Limited factory in Long Branch, Ontario, and later at Holland & Holland in Britain, the most accurate barrels were hand-selected. They were the elite of the production line, modified with a wooden cheekpiece on the stock to align the shooter's eye perfectly with the optic, and fitted with the No. 32 telescopic sight. The scope itself was a marvel of pragmatism. Originally designed for the Bren light machine gun, the No. 32 offered a 3.5x magnification. It wasn't the highest magnification optic of the war, but it was incredibly robust. It could withstand the shocks of battle, the knocking against tank hulls, and the mud of the trenches without losing its zero. For a Canadian sniper crawling through the ruins of an Italian village or the marshes of the Scheldt, durability was worth more than magnification. But the true terror of the Lee Enfield lay in its action. The bolt mechanism was short and incredibly smooth, allowing a trained shooter to cycle a new round into the chamber without lifting his eye from the scope. This was the famous Mad Minute capability, the ability to fire 20 to 30 aimed rounds in 60 seconds. Against a German sniper using a Mauser, this was a decisive advantage. If a German missed his first shot, the manipulation of his bolt was slower and often required breaking his sight picture. If a Canadian missed, which was rare, a second round was on its way almost instantly. German infantrymen quickly learned the difference. A single shot might be an accident or a stray bullet, but two rapid, accurate shots from nowhere? That was the signature of a Lee Enfield. It meant they were being hunted by a professional. The ammunition, the .303 British round, was heavy and hit with devastating kinetic energy. At ranges of 600 to 800 yards, distances where German infantry felt relatively safe from standard rifle fire, the Canadian sniper was lethal. The bullet traveled at supersonic speeds. For the target, this created a terrifying acoustic phenomenon. The crack of the bullet passing was heard before the thump of the rifle firing. By the time the sound of the shot arrived, the man next to you was already dead. This delay between death and sound sowed confusion. Officers would shout orders to take cover from the wrong direction, not knowing where the shot originated. And in that moment of confusion, the second round would fly. However, a rifle is only as dangerous as the man holding it. The true nightmare for the German soldier wasn't the technology, it was the tactic. It was the way the Canadians disappeared. The term ghillie suit is standard in modern military parlance, but in World War II, it was a rough, improvised art form. Canadian snipers did not receive pristine camouflage suits from a factory. They built them. Using standard-issue denim battle dress or captured parachutes as a base, they would sew on strips of burlap, Hessian cloth, and netting. But the suit was never finished. Before every mission, the sniper would alter his skin. If he was operating in the rubble of Ortona, he would rub brick dust and gray mortar into the fabric. If he was in the forests of the Netherlands, he would weave fresh foliage, twigs, and long grass into the netting. The goal was to break up the human silhouette. The human eye is trained to recognize the shape of a head and shoulders, the target indicator. The Canadian sniper erased this geometry. He became a bush, a pile of rubble, or a shadow. This commitment to concealment went beyond clothing. It was a physical discipline known as the stalk. To get into a firing position, a Canadian sniper team, shooter and spotter, might crawl for hours to cover a few hundred yards. They moved inches at a time, dragging their kit bags with their toes to avoid raising a hand. They learned to endure the agony of cramping muscles, the bite of insects, and the soaking wet of European winters without flinching. There are accounts of Canadian snipers lying in position for 2 or 3 days, urinating in their trousers rather than risking the movement to relieve themselves. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a single moment of carelessness from the enemy. This patience allowed them to execute the most feared tactic of all, the cold shot. In ballistics, a cold shot refers to the very first round fired from a rifle barrel that is not yet warmed up. It is the most difficult shot to predict, as the metal of the barrel behaves differently when cold. Canadian snipers practiced this relentlessly. They didn't need sighters or warm-up shots that would give away their position. They trained to make the first bullet count, knowing it might be the only one they got before the enemy returned fire with mortars. And who did they target? This was the final piece of the psychological puzzle. The Canadian doctrine was ruthless in its efficiency. They didn't just shoot at any German helmet that appeared. They practiced high-value target selection. First, they looked for the officers. They identified them by their behavior, the way they pointed, the way others deferred to them, or the binoculars around their necks. Killing an officer paralyzed the platoon. Without orders, the disciplined German machine ground to a halt. Next, they targeted the NCOs, non-commissioned officers. Then, the radio operators, severing the unit's connection to artillery support. Finally, the machine gunners and tank commanders. By systematically removing the leadership and the heavy weapons, A single two-man Canadian sniper team could halt the advance of an entire German company. They turned the German chain of command into a death sentence. Soldiers stopped saluting their officers in the field for fear of marking them for death. Officers removed their rank insignias and covered their binoculars, terrified of the invisible eyes watching from the tree line. The dead zone, the area of influence of a Canadian sniper, was absolute. It was a radius of 1,000 yards where the normal rules of war did not apply. In this zone, you didn't need to be attacking to die. You could be eating, writing a letter home, or simply standing up to stretch your legs. For the German soldier on the receiving end, the terror came from the realization that they were never truly safe. The front line wasn't just where the tanks were. The front line was anywhere a Canadian rifleman could see. And as the war pushed into the dense urban combat of Italy and the hedgerows of France, the Canadians proved that they could see almost anything. The rifle was the tool. The camouflage was the cloak. But the method was pure psychological dismantling. They didn't just kill the enemy. They made the enemy afraid to live. A bullet kills a man, but the threat of a bullet kills an army's will to fight. This was the grim calculus of the Canadian sniper. By 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, the war had evolved into a grinding attrition. For the average German infantryman, death usually announced itself. Artillery screamed as it fell. Tanks rumbled the earth. Bombers droned in the sky. These were terrifying, yes, but they were tangible. You could run from them. You could hide in a bunker and wait for the noise to stop. But you cannot run from silence. The psychological impact of the Canadian sniper lay in the imposition of a new, terrifying reality: paranoia. In sectors where Canadian snipers were known to operate, like the rubble-choked streets of Ortona or the hedgerows of Normandy, the behavior of the German army changed fundamentally. The simple acts of being a soldier, or even just a human being, became life-threatening gambles. Imagine the stress of a German sentry. He knows that somewhere in the mesmerizing pattern of the leaves, or in the dark recess of a ruined barn 600 yards away, a Canadian is watching him. He doesn't know where. He doesn't know when. He only knows that if he lights a cigarette, the flare of the match might be the last thing he sees. If he stands up to stretch his cramping legs, he dies. If he goes to the latrine, he dies. This constant state of hypervigilance created a corrosive, exhausting anxiety. German medical reports from the front lines began to describe a specific type of combat fatigue among units facing Canadians. It wasn't just shell shock. It was a nervous exhaustion born from the inability to sleep. Soldiers were terrified to close their eyes, convinced that the moment they drifted off, the ghosts would close in. The landscape itself became the enemy. An open intersection in a French village was no longer just a road, it was a kill zone. A fluttering curtain in a window was no longer a breeze, it was a signal. Veterans of the Wehrmacht later recalled the feeling of being naked, even behind cover. One survivor wrote in a letter home, "It felt like the Canadians could see through the trees. We stopped walking. We crawled like rats. We lived in the dirt because to stand up was to commit suicide." This was the true weapon of the Canadian sniper. He didn't need to fire 100 rounds to suppress a unit. He only needed to fire one round, kill one man, and the remaining 40 men would freeze, paralyzed by the fear of who would be next. Chapter 5. The Tactical Paralysis. This fear had a devastating strategic effect. In military terms, it is known as a force multiplier. A single two-man Canadian sniper team, a shooter and a spotter, could effectively pin down a German company of 120 men. This is a staggering asymmetry. 2 men, consuming minimal supplies and occupying a tiny footprint, could halt the advance of a mechanized unit worth millions of Reichsmarks. During the advance through Italy, this dynamic played out repeatedly. A German platoon would be moving to reinforce a position. Suddenly, the lead scout drops dead. The column hits the dirt. They deploy machine guns, spraying the hillsides blindly. They call for mortar support. They wait for hours, terrified to move. Meanwhile, the Canadian sniper has already slipped away, relocating to a new position to flank them, or simply waiting for them to make a mistake. The advance stops. The timetable is broken. The initiative is lost. The Canadians weaponized this paralysis. They understood that a dead soldier is a tragedy for the enemy, but a wounded soldier is a logistical nightmare. In the dark pragmatism of war, some Canadian snipers employed the baiting tactic. They would intentionally shoot a German soldier in the leg or the gut, a painful, non-immediate lethal wound. The soldier would scream for help. His cries would echo across the battlefield, tearing at the nerves of his comrades. Instinct and camaraderie would compel a medic or a squad mate to rush out to drag him to safety. Crack! The rescuer falls. Now there are 2 bodies in the kill zone. It was cruel. It was ruthless. But it was psychological warfare in its purest, most brutal form. It forced the German commanders to make impossible choices: abandon their dying men and destroy morale, or risk more lives to save them. This tactic sowed hatred and fear in equal measure. It broke the bond of trust between soldiers. Men began to hesitate when their friends called for help. That hesitation, that split second of doubt, is the sound of an army's spirit breaking. By the time the Canadian Army pushed into the Netherlands in the final year of the war, their reputation had morphed into myth. The Germans had a name for them: Geister im Nebel, ghosts in the fog. The fear was so pervasive that it caused chaos within the German command structure. As mentioned earlier, snipers specifically targeted officers. This led to a breakdown in unit cohesion. Without officers to issue orders, German counterattacks faltered before they even began. In the Battle of the Scheldt, fought in miserable, flooded terrain, the psychological dominance was absolute. The terrain offered little cover, yet the Canadians seemed to thrive in it. They utilized the water, the mud, and the reeds to move unseen. German prisoners captured in this sector often asked their captors the same question: "Where is your army?" They were shocked to discover that the force that had pinned them down for 2 days was just a handful of men with scoped rifles, covered in mud, smoking cigarettes, and cleaning their optics. The realization was humiliating. The mighty Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe with the Blitzkrieg, was being dismantled piece by men they couldn't even see. This psychological victory was perhaps more important than the body count. The Canadian sniper stripped the German soldier of his feeling of superiority. He made the enemy feel hunted, helpless, and small. And among these anonymous hunters, there were names that rose above the rest. Individuals whose skills were so supernatural that they became legends on both sides of the line. Men who didn't just instill fear, they became the embodiment of it. History often remembers the generals who moved flags on a map, but the soldiers on the ground remembered the men who kept them alive by clearing the path ahead. Among the ranks of the Canadian Army, certain names began to circulate, names that were whispered with reverence in the mess halls and with dread in the German trenches. These were not just soldiers. They were artists of their grim trade. 1. Sergeant Harold Marshall, the ghost of the Italian front. The Italian campaign was a sniper's war. The rugged mountains, the shattered stone villages, and the freezing winters created a three-dimensional battlefield where death could come from any window or ridge. It was here, in the brutal winter of 1943-1944, that Sergeant Harold Marshall etched his name into history. A member of the Calgary Highlanders Sniper Section, Marshall became the poster child for the Canadian Sniper Corps, quite literally. A famous photograph exists of him, crouching with his Lee Enfield No. 4T, a half-smile on his face, the embodiment of confidence. But behind that image lay a predator of terrifying focus. Marshall's domain was the rubble of Ortona and the snowy peaks of the Apennines. His specialty was counter-sniping. The Germans had filled the mountains with their own marksmen, tasked with picking off Allied officers. Marshall's job was to hunt the hunters. Witnesses described his ability to lie in a snowbank for hours, letting the frost accumulate on his shoulders, his breath held shallow to avoid creating vapor clouds. He became a statue. When a German sniper fired, revealing his position with a muzzle flash, Marshall would calculate the angle, the wind, and the drop in a fraction of a second. His bolt would cycle once. The German threat would end. Marshall was known for an unnaturally rapid and accurate rate of fire. In the chaotic street fighting of Ortona, where enemies appeared and disappeared in seconds, this speed was vital. He didn't just suppress the enemy, he dominated the space, creating a zone of safety for the Canadian infantry advancing behind him. To the Germans facing him, he wasn't a man. He was the biting wind of the mountains itself. 2. Corporal Jim Landon, the shadow of Normandy. If Italy was a vertical war, Normandy was a claustrophobic nightmare. After the landings at Juno Beach in June 1944, the Canadians pushed inland into the bocage, the hedgerow country. Here, visibility was measured in feet, not miles. It was a labyrinth of thick vegetation and stone walls. In this green hell, Corporal Jim Landon of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division became a myth. Landon was different. Most snipers preferred stationary targets. Landon possessed the rare, almost preternatural ability to hit moving targets with consistency. As the Germans retreated from the beaches, attempting to regroup, they were often sprinting between cover. For a standard rifleman, a running target at 400 yards is nearly impossible to hit. For Landon, it was routine. His area of operation became known among German units as the dead zone. Intelligence reports suggest that Landon was frequently utilized for decapitation strikes. As Canadian tanks struggled to push through the narrow lanes, often falling victim to hidden German anti-tank guns or MG-42 nests, Landon would infiltrate ahead of the armor. He would identify the German officers coordinating the defense or the NCOs directing the machine gun fire. With surgical precision, he would dismantle the German command structure. A tank commander popping his head out of a hatch? Gone. A machine gunner adjusting his sights? Gone. By the time the main Canadian force arrived, the German defenders were often leaderless and disoriented, their morale shattered by the shadow of Normandy, who seemed to be everywhere at once. 3. Corporal Roy Ackerman, master of camouflage. As the war moved north towards the Netherlands, the terrain flattened, offering less natural cover. Here, the art of the sniper shifted from marksmanship to magic. Enter Corporal Roy Ackerman. Ackerman was not just a shooter, he was an artisan of the ghillie suit. While all snipers used camouflage, Ackerman elevated it to an obsession. He understood that in the flat, gray landscape of the Low Countries, the human silhouette was a death sentence. He would spend hours before a mission constructing his suit. He didn't just attach burlap, he studied the specific vegetation of the sector he was entering. He used mud to cake his rifle, sandbags to break up the line of his shoulders, and local foliage to blend seamlessly with the earth. There are accounts of Ackerman positioning himself in an open field, with absolutely no hard cover, relying entirely on his suit. German patrols would walk within 20 meters of him, completely unaware that death was lying at their feet. But Ackermann's true power was his discipline. He was famous for his fire discipline. He would track a German unit for hours, watching them, learning their routine, identifying the high-value targets. He would not fire at the first soldier he saw. He waited. He let them get comfortable. He let them think they were safe. Only when he had a 100% probability of a kill and an escape route planned would he take the shot. In the battles for Rimini and later in Groningen, Ackermann famously locked down an entire German supply route for over 12 hours single-handedly. Drivers refused to enter the corridor because they knew the master of camouflage was watching, but they could never find him. 4. Sergeant John Jack Tasker, the silent hunter of the Scheldt. Finally, there was the Battle of the Scheldt in late 1944, a campaign fought in a flooded purgatory of mud, dikes, and cold water. It was arguably the most miserable terrain of the entire war. It was here that Sergeant John Jack Tasker of the 1st Canadian Army forged his legend. The Scheldt offered almost no high ground. Snipers had to operate in waist-deep water, fighting hypothermia as much as the enemy. Tasker thrived in this misery. He was a specialist in anti-sniper operations in the most difficult conditions imaginable. The Germans knew the Canadians were coming and had set up extensive ambush positions along the dikes. Tasker's job was to go into the gray wasteland and root them out. Tasker was credited with making shots that the Germans believed were ballistically impossible. He understood the heavy, wet air of the Scheldt and how it affected bullet trajectory. When German soldiers stood on the far side of a flooded field, believing they were out of range, Tasker proved them fatally wrong. But it was his role in the liberation of Antwerp that cemented his reputation. Tasker acted as a guardian angel for the advancing infantry. He moved silently along the flanks, a solitary figure in the mist, neutralizing threats before the main force even saw them. A post-action report described him simply: a silent figure who controlled entire sections of the battlefield. To the men he served with, he was a savior. To the Germans in the mud opposite him, he was the inevitable end. 5. The Canadian Doctrine, a brotherhood of shadows. These 4 men, Marshall, Landon, Ackermann, Tasker, were unique individuals, yet they shared a common DNA. They were the product of the Canadian Sniper Doctrine. Unlike other armies that treated snipers as lone wolves or mere sharpshooters, Canada integrated them into the fabric of their fighting force. They built specialized observation and sniper platoons, a model that was years ahead of its time. They perfected the symbiotic relationship between the shooter and the spotter. They taught their men that the rifle was secondary to the mind. They targeted the brain of the enemy army, the officers, the radio men, the specialists, knowing that if you kill the head, the body dies. In the end, their legacy was not just in the number of enemies neutralized, but in the psychological scar they left on the Wehrmacht. They earned their title, given by a terrified enemy: Geister im Nebel, ghosts in the fog. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Allied armies were pouring across the Rhine, a tidal wave of steel and fire. When military historians analyze World War II, they often focus on the titans of the battlefield. They speak of the Tiger and Panther tanks, 60-ton monsters of German engineering that struck fear into Allied crews with their impenetrable armor and high-velocity cannons. They speak of the screeching dive of the Stuka bomber, or the earth-shaking barrages of the Katyusha rockets. These were the loud fears. They were weapons of mass destruction, designed to shock and awe through sheer volume and violence. They were undeniable. You could hear them coming from miles away. You could prepare yourself. You could pray. But for the average German grenadier huddling in a foxhole in the Netherlands, or retreating through the ruins of an Italian villa, there was a different kind of fear. A fear that was far more intimate and far more corrosive. It was the invisible fear. It didn't weigh 60 tons. It didn't scream from the sky. It lay patiently in the mud, wrapped in burlap and silence, weighing no more than a man. The Canadian sniper represented the ultimate asymmetry of war. The Germans could deploy a tank division to hold a sector, yet that entire division could be stalled, blinded, and demoralized by a single ghost they could not see. While the tank destroyed buildings, the sniper destroyed the mind. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Hunters. Why does the legend of the Canadian sniper resonate so powerfully through history? Perhaps it is because they represented a unique convergence of culture and conflict. They were not programmed killing machines produced by a factory. They were hunters. They brought the skills of the Yukon trapline, the Saskatchewan prairie, and the Ontario forest to the industrial slaughterhouse of Europe. They took the chaotic, mechanized violence of the 20th century and slowed it down to a single, breathless moment. The German army, for all its discipline and technological prowess, never fully solved the riddle of the Canadian sniper. They could bomb the coordinates, they could mortar the tree lines, but they could not kill a shadow. In the final analysis, the effectiveness of these men was not measured merely in the number of rounds fired or enemies killed, though those numbers were substantial. It was measured in the meals the enemy never ate because they were too afraid to light a fire. It was measured in the sleep they never got. It was measured in the orders that were never given because the officer lay dead in the grass. Sergeant Harold Marshall, Corporal Jim Landon, Corporal Roy Ackerman, Sergeant Jack Tasker, and thousands of other unnamed marksmen did not win the war solely with their rifles. They won it by breaking the enemy's belief that they could survive the day. As the dust settled over Europe in May 1945, the roar of the tanks faded. The bombers landed. The artillery fell silent. But for the survivors of the Wehrmacht, the silence would always be suspicious. They had learned a terrifying lesson on the road from Ortona to the Scheldt. In modern war, the most dangerous thing is not the giant machine you can hear coming. It is the quiet patience of a hunter you will never see. And for the Canadian sniper, that was the only truth that mattered. One bullet, one target, and then nothing but silence.